Welcome to Tales by Tochi. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. In the Faculty of Social Sciences at St. Lincoln University, a thick air of unease always lingered, especially among the female students. It wasn't something openly spoken about, but everyone knew the truth that crawled beneath the school's polished reputation. The students didn't fear their exams as much as they feared Professor Desmond. He was tall, articulate, and carried himself with the quiet arrogance of a man who knew he was untouchable. A senior lecturer with over a decade of experience, his voice carried weight in board meetings and his signature could determine the future of any student. He rarely raised his voice, but his silence, his stares, and his subtle threats said more than any words could. Desmond was not just a predator, he was a master manipulator, the kind who didn't need to chase after his victims. He made them come to him. And when they didn't, he crushed their dreams slowly, subject by subject, semester by semester. The whispering began as early as a girl's second semester. Those quiet talks in dorms, the warnings in bathroom stalls, and the text messages from unknown numbers saying, "Avoid his course if you can." But in a compulsory course there was no escape. Desmond had built his empire on silence. His strategy was flawless. Offer mentorship, pretend to care, draw the student in, and then set the trap. If she agreed, she passed. If she didn't, her grades would sink, her complaints would disappear into a void, and her mental health would spiral. Many girls came into the university with dreams of graduating with first-class honors. But when they passed through his office, they left with nightmares instead. Desmond's favors didn't end at one-time encounters. He often blackmailed the girls afterward, threatening to leak recorded conversations or photos if they spoke out. And when one girl tried to report him in her third year, Desmond used his connections to make it look like she cheated in an exam. She was rusticated within days, and her name became a cautionary tale. "Don't be like Stephanie," they would whisper in the hostels. She tried to fight Desmond. And so, silence was maintained, not because the girls were weak, but because they were wise enough to know that in a system rigged against them, fighting the devil could destroy you. It wasn't just fear that kept them quiet, it was survival. But there were always new students. Freshers who hadn't yet learned the hidden rules of St. Lincoln. Every year, a few of them walked in with heads high, books clutched to their chests, confident that brilliance and hard work were enough. Desmond watched them with amusement, like a lion studying naive cubs. He waited patiently, letting them score high on their first tests, building their confidence. Then he would strike. For him, it was never just about gratification, it was about power. He enjoyed seeing hope crumble in a girl's eyes, enjoyed the silence that followed after their resistance failed. His reputation was so dangerous that even other male lecturers stayed quiet, either because they were afraid or complicit. And while the university management remained blind, the students bore the consequences. Girls dropped out, changed departments, or simply lost themselves. Some stayed and played his game, hoping it would end after graduation. But it never did. Because for Desmond, St. Lincoln was his kingdom, and the female students were his prey. Until one semester one girl, unlike the rest, walked into his class. She was calm, quiet, and stunningly brilliant. And though he didn't know it yet, her presence would bring his empire crumbling to its knees. In every corner of St. Lincoln University, there were unspoken stories, ghosts that walked among the living. Girls who once smiled brightly in lecture halls now moved like shadows, their laughter replaced with cautious glances and quiet steps. They were the invisible victims of Desmond's dark reign. And though they lived among their peers, they no longer felt like students. One such girl, Adesawa, was in her final year, yet her eyes told a story of someone who had already aged far beyond her youth. She had once been the brightest girl in her department, always speaking confidently in class. But after one too many visits to Desmond's office, her energy disappeared. Now she rarely spoke, avoided eye contact with everyone, and never stayed late on campus. She had become a shell of her former self. And she wasn't alone. There was another girl, Cynthia, who had once tried to stand up to Desmond, boldly turning down his advances. Within a semester, she was accused of plagiarism and given a disciplinary suspension. Her academic dream died in silence, and no one dared follow in her footsteps. These stories were passed down from one generation of female students to another, like a tragic inheritance. Some girls, overwhelmed by fear and desperation, gave in and told themselves it was just one night to save their futures. Others lived with regret and shame. Desmond's manipulation wasn't always direct. Sometimes he used his influence to make girls feel as if they had no choice. He would mark their scripts unfairly, assign vague coursework with impossible grading, or simply block their project approvals. When the victims eventually submitted, he'd act like he was doing them a favor. And if any of them tried to protest, they were gaslighted or isolated. A few of his favorite students, those he had previously manipulated, were now part of his strategy. They were his informants, luring unsuspecting girls into trusting him. One of them, Pamela, had a bitter smile and a hollow look in her eyes. She didn't like what she was doing, but she was too deep in his grasp to escape. Her grades, her recommendations, and her entire future were all tied to Desmond. In that broken system, many girls made peace with their pain, hoping time would eventually heal them. But time doesn't heal what is continuously inflicted. Each new academic year brought fresh victims and buried more truths. No lecturer dared question Desmond. He was seen as too brilliant to be wrong. He published academic papers, represented the university at national conferences, and was respected outside for the very intelligence he used as a weapon within. Management valued his accolades and ignored his victims. Female students began to learn how to read the danger signs. Don't go to his office alone, avoid eye contact during lectures, and never reply to his late-night emails. Yet, despite all these precautions, some still fell into his net. The system didn't protect them. And so, many girls either endured him silently or left the school entirely. It was a cycle. A deadly, soul-crushing cycle. And everyone had adjusted to it. Everyone except the girl who was about to become his undoing, Nina. Nina Williams stepped onto the St. Lincoln campus with quiet confidence. She wasn't loud, she didn't seek attention, and she dressed simply in jeans and modest tops. Yet, heads turned whenever she walked by, not just because of her stunning beauty, but because of the unspoken grace she carried. She was the kind of girl who didn't need to say much to make an impression. Beneath her reserved demeanor was a razor-sharp mind. Her academic records from her previous university were unmatched. Top of her class, multiple scholarships, and glowing recommendations. She had transferred to St. Lincoln not because of failure or scandal, but because of her father's personal request. Richard Williams, her father, was a man of extreme wealth and influence, one of the wealthiest men in the country. But he preferred a life away from the spotlight and had raised Nina to value humility, hard work, and privacy. Not even her closest friends knew who her father truly was. Nina lived in a modest off-campus apartment and took public transport like everyone else. She believed in earning her place, not using her father's shadow to get ahead. In class, Nina was exceptional. Her answers were thoughtful, her essays brilliantly argued, and her test scores perfect. She was the type of student lecturers loved, until her intelligence began to threaten egos. Desmond noticed her during a departmental seminar. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice was soft, yet piercing with clarity. Her eyes held a level of self-assurance that irritated him. He studied her from afar, sensing she would be a challenge. And for Desmond, challenges were irresistible. He started small, giving her compliments in class, offering feedback on her assignments, and eventually sending her a carefully worded email about a supposed research opportunity. Nina ignored the invitation. That's when Desmond became intrigued. He wasn't used to rejection, especially not from girls like her. He sent another email. She didn't respond. Then he started calling on her more frequently in class, pushing her with difficult questions, hoping to catch her off guard. But she always answered flawlessly, maintaining respect without ever giving him an inch of personal familiarity. Word about Nina spread quickly. Some students admired her, others whispered that she would soon fall like the rest. A few of the girls who had suffered at Desmond's hands watched her with a mixture of hope and fear. Was she strong enough to resist him? Or would she end up broken too? Meanwhile, Desmond grew more persistent. He sent her graded scripts with notes like, "Come to my office for feedback," and "Let's talk about your career goals." Nina began to see the pattern others had warned her about. One evening, as she sat with her roommate reviewing notes, the girl leaned in and whispered, "Be careful, Nina. He's watching you." But Nina, though aware of the growing tension, refused to be afraid. She had dealt with entitled men before. What she didn't know, however, was that Desmond wasn't just entitled, he was dangerous. And in his mind, she wasn't a student. She was a prize he hadn't yet conquered. Desmond was a man who didn't take well to disobedience. In his world, every resistance was an invitation to dominate. And Nina's indifference was like a challenge carved into stone. Each day, he watched her enter class with her neatly tied scarf, her books tucked under her arm, and that expressionless look on her face. It infuriated him. She wasn't scared. She wasn't impressed. And most importantly, she wasn't giving him attention. It was a blow to his ego. Girls like Nina were not supposed to act that way. He had built his reputation on breaking even the strongest minds, bending even the most confident students into submission. But Nina walked past him like he was just another lecturer. He didn't like that. He started to plot, slowly and deliberately. First, he called her out in front of the class, subtly embarrassing her with critical remarks. When she answered correctly, he found ways to minimize her points. "Good try," he would say with a condescending smirk, "but let's hear a more practical explanation." Still, Nina held her ground, never rude, never shaken. But Desmond had made up his mind. He would not let her win. He began using his typical tactics. In her mid-semester test, Nina wrote brilliant essays that should have earned her an A. When results were posted, she had a C. Confused, she checked the grading. There were vague comments like "too abstract" and "lacks proper structure," which made no sense. She scheduled a meeting with Desmond to clarify, hoping there was some mistake. But during their meeting, he dismissed her questions and instead steered the conversation to her ambition and how exceptional students often needed guidance beyond the classroom. Nina left that office shaken, not out of fear but because she realized what he was doing. He was playing the same game everyone warned her about. That day she promised herself that she wouldn't bend. She would work harder, score higher, and expose him silently by succeeding without him. But Desmond wasn't going to let go that easily. In his next class he barely acknowledged her. Then, just before dismissing everyone, he said, "Some of you will fail no matter how smart you think you are." His eyes locked with hers. The message was clear. Behind the scenes, Desmond intensified his manipulation. He instructed 2 of his loyal students, girls who had become his pawns, to invite Nina to an exclusive mentorship circle. They promised career tips, connections with employers, and exam hints. Nina declined. She saw through the act. Then came the subtle threats, anonymous messages warning her to be more cooperative, and classroom assignments that were mysteriously marked late even when submitted on time. Her GPA began to slip. Her friends noticed the change. "You're too proud," one of them said. "Why not just play along a little?" But Nina refused. "If I fail, I'll fail with dignity," she answered. It was a bold stance, but dangerous. Desmond had destroyed smarter girls. And now he was determined to break Nina, even if it meant using the darkest tricks in his arsenal. Nina knew the battle she had entered wasn't going to be won with grades or wit alone. Desmond was powerful in ways that weren't visible in course outlines or student handbooks. She saw it in how other lecturers bowed slightly when he walked past, in how students' eyes shifted uneasily whenever his name was mentioned. She was already feeling the weight of her resistance. Her test scores were dropping, not from lack of performance but from deliberate sabotage. She stayed up late studying, rewriting notes, submitting extra assignments, yet nothing seemed to matter. Every grade she received was a slap in the face, and her complaints to other lecturers met cold, rehearsed responses. "Try to speak directly with Professor Desmond," or "just do better next time." She began to see just how deeply Desmond's influence ran. Still, Nina refused to back down. She didn't come this far to be bullied. Her pride wasn't born of arrogance, it was survival. Every night she stared at the framed picture of her and her father on her desk, remembering the promise she made before leaving home, to make him proud through merit alone. Desmond, on the other hand, was growing increasingly irritated. Nina's defiance was unlike anything he had dealt with before. Most girls cracked after a few failed grades or veiled threats, but Nina wasn't even flinching. He saw her redoing assignments late into the evening in the school library, sometimes even helping others who had failed. Her silence wasn't fear, it was strategic. It mocked him. It made him feel powerless and he hated it. He began to consider more aggressive approaches. If she wouldn't submit through fear, then maybe she'd break through isolation. He started spreading rumors through his informants. Whispers that Nina thought she was better than everyone else, that she was proud, cold, and arrogant. Slowly people began to pull away. Study partners stopped showing up. She was excluded from group discussions. Even her roommate, pressured by one of Desmond's loyal girls, began to act distant. Nina felt the walls closing in. Her spirit ached, but she held it together with silent strength. She didn't need friends to survive, she needed justice. But justice felt so far away. Nina tried reaching out to the student union, but the moment she mentioned Desmond's name, the student leader's face tightened. "I'll see what I can do," he said nervously, and she never heard from him again. She began documenting everything. Photocopies of her test scripts, screenshots of emails, audio recordings of certain classes. She was preparing for war even though it felt like she was alone in it. At night, she cried quietly into her pillow, not out of weakness, but out of the exhaustion of fighting a system built to silence girls like her. She had no idea how far Desmond was willing to go. She had no idea that, behind closed doors, he was already planning his final trap. And she certainly didn't know that her refusal to submit would become the reason he'd commit the most unforgivable crime of his life. In the deep belly of the social sciences department, Desmond sat at his desk, flipping through student files with cold calculation. He had profiles on nearly every female student who had passed through his office, where they lived, what their weaknesses were, how quickly they broke, and how far he had pushed them. It wasn't about sex anymore, it was about control. Each victim fed his ego, cementing his belief that he was above consequences. Even when whispers floated to higher authorities, he manipulated them with ease, offering glowing reports, reminding them of the awards he had brought to the university, and throwing blame onto troubled students who wanted to spoil his name for rejecting their advances. It was a sick game and he played it well. His network of enablers helped him cover tracks, erase emails, and silence dissent. And when necessary, he destroyed reputations. Desmond knew the system better than anyone, and he had used it to build his kingdom of silence. Some of the girls who had once been his victims were now trapped in a different kind of prison. Loyalty through fear. Pamela, for instance, had once tried to resist. But after Desmond threatened to accidentally fail her final project, she gave in. When he saw her shame afterward, he offered her protection instead. "You're special," he told her. "Help me help others." That was how he turned victims into pawns. Pamela now helped monitor new girls, subtly guiding them into situations where Desmond could take control. She hated herself for it, but she had no way out. Her parents were poor, her grades now rested on Desmond's desk, and every attempt to pull away was met with gentle blackmail. She tried to warn Nina once, casually in passing. "Be careful with Dr. Desmond," she said with eyes full of guilt. But Nina just smiled politely and walked away. Pamela sighed. She had seen that look before. Hope. It never lasted. The pattern was always the same. Brilliant girl resists, Desmond blocks progress. Girl gets desperate, Desmond offers help, and the girl finally yields either out of fear, shame, or exhaustion. Then came the cover-up, grades fixed, rumors suppressed, everything cleaned like nothing happened. The girl would move on, but the damage remained. Some girls dropped out after, others graduated and buried the memory. A few never recovered mentally. But the school? It continued to praise Desmond. Parents adored him. Colleagues respected him. He was a favorite of the board. No one wanted to question the man who brought prestige to the department. To most, he was a symbol of academic excellence. Only the girls knew the truth. And Desmond was convinced he could do it all forever. Until Nina arrived. She broke the pattern. She refused every step. And for the first time in a long time, Desmond felt the uncomfortable sting of being challenged. And it infuriated him. Nina stood outside the department's notice board, staring in disbelief at her newly posted results. It was the third time she had failed Desmond's course. Her script had been flawless. Her arguments sharp, her references clear, and her formatting impeccable. Yet again she had been given a low grade. Her heart sank, but not from surprise. By now, she knew this was Desmond's way of tightening the noose. She clenched her jaw and walked into the faculty building with her head high. She wasn't going to let him win. "Professor Desmond is in a meeting," his assistant said when she asked to see him. Nina sat and waited for 2 hours. When she was finally led into his office, she met him smiling as if they were old friends. "Nina," he said warmly, "I was just reviewing your script." She sat across from him, calm but firm. "I don't understand the grade, sir," she said, sliding her marked paper forward. "I think I deserve an explanation." Desmond leaned back, sighing as if the conversation bored him. "You're brilliant, Nina. No doubt. But brilliance isn't everything. You lack depth, maturity. There are things you'll need to learn that can't be taught in class." Nina narrowed her eyes. "Like what?" she asked coldly. Desmond stood up, walked to the door, and locked it. The sound of the bolt clicking echoed through the room. "Don't be afraid," he said softly. "I want to help you, Nina. You have potential. But you're fighting too hard. That kind of pride will get you nowhere." Nina stood immediately. "Open the door," she said, voice trembling but brave. Desmond laughed. "No one will believe you, Nina. You're failing. I'm trying to help. If you just stop resisting, everything will go smoothly. You'll graduate top of your class. You have nothing to lose." Nina stared at him, disgusted. "I'd rather start over than take help from you." For a moment, Desmond's smile faltered. Then he sat back down. "You'll change your mind?" he said. "They always do." Nina stormed out. Her hands were shaking. But her heart was stronger than ever. Desmond had just shown his hand, and now she knew what she was truly up against. As she walked across the courtyard, students passed her by like any other day. But something inside her had shifted. She realized she wasn't just trying to protect her grades anymore, she was protecting herself. Her body. Her dignity. She thought of her father, of how he always told her, "If the world ever tries to buy you, walk away. You're not for sale." She clutched her bag tightly. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about every girl he had hurt. And she wasn't going to run. But Desmond was already preparing his next move. He had tried kindness. He had tried manipulation. And now he was thinking of something far darker, something that would change Nina's life forever. It started with a single notification. Nina had received an F in Desmond's course, the final grade. It meant she would have to repeat the entire semester. Her heart raced as she stood in front of the school's online result board. The noise of students around her faded into the background. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked through the portal again, hoping it was a glitch. But it wasn't. Desmond had delivered his first major blow. Her performance across other courses was still strong, but his course was compulsory, and a fail meant an automatic delay in graduation. As expected, when she approached the head of department to appeal, he shrugged and said, "Professor Desmond's assessments are final. If he failed you, there must be a reason." The words hit harder than she expected. No questions asked. No investigation. Just blind loyalty. It confirmed what she had feared. Desmond held more power than she imagined. She walked out of the office with a stony expression, but inside, her spirit was flickering. This was no longer just a personal vendetta. This was war. Nina considered calling her father, but the thought of burdening him made her stop. He had always supported her dreams, and she had insisted on attending school without his interference. But now she wondered if her pride was slowly becoming her prison. Still, she was determined to find another way. That evening, she met with a small group of female students who had also failed mysteriously over the semesters. Most of them were too afraid to speak up, but one girl, Linda, opened up about her ordeal. "He failed me twice," she said quietly. "Then I met with him one evening. After that, I passed." The room fell silent. Another girl nodded in agreement. "He's been doing it for years." Nina took notes carefully, her fingers shaking as she documented everything. "What if we go to the media?" she asked. Linda laughed bitterly. "Do you think they'll listen to us? Or that the school won't cover it up?" Nina didn't respond. Her mind was already spinning. If the school wouldn't fight for them, then maybe she'd have to fight alone. But Desmond wasn't done. The following week, he sent Nina a handwritten note through a student messenger. It read, "Let's talk about your future. I have a solution. Office. 6 p.m. She crushed the note in her palm. It was happening. He was setting the trap. She knew it now. That was his method. Isolate, frustrate, and corner. Her GPA was tanking. Her friends were distant. Her appeals were ignored. And now he was offering a lifeline she'd never accept. Her heart ached, not just for herself, but for every girl who had once stood where she now stood. But as strong as her will was, Nina was still human. That night she cried until her eyes were sore, staring at the ceiling in darkness. For the first time she felt the full weight of hopelessness pressing down on her chest. Yet even in the dark she whispered to herself, "I will not give him that power. I will not break." What she didn't know, however, was that Desmond had already made up his mind. And the next time she stepped into his office, she wouldn't leave the same. Desmond's office was eerily quiet at 6 p.m. that evening. The corridors were mostly empty, and the few lights that flickered inside the department created long, stretching shadows on the tiled floor. Nina stood at the entrance of the building, her bag slung over her shoulder, her thoughts loud. She hadn't come to surrender. She came to confront him, to record the conversation if possible, and to make him say enough to finally expose him. Her heart pounded as she walked in. When she reached his door, it was already open. "Come in," he said smoothly from behind his desk, the lights dimmer than usual. "Sit." She hesitated, then stepped inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. Desmond rose and shut it gently behind her. Nina flinched. He turned and smiled. "Relax, Nina. I just want to talk." She sat, her back straight, her phone secretly recording from inside her purse. He poured 2 glasses of juice from a flask on his desk. "You're a smart girl," he began, sliding a glass toward her. "But smart girls don't always make smart choices. Nina didn't touch the drink. Desmond's tone shifted subtly from friendly to manipulative. "You've failed this course," he said. "But that's not the end. I can change your results. I've done it before. But you have to meet me halfway." Nina stared at him. "Are you saying I can't pass unless I give you what you want?" she asked. He smiled, not answering directly. Instead he leaned forward. "What do you want, Nina? Do you want to graduate or repeat this class another year?" Her voice cracked slightly. "I want to be treated fairly." His face hardened. "Then make a fair decision." She stood up. "I'm leaving." That was when it happened. Desmond moved faster than she anticipated. He grabbed her wrist. "Sit down," he hissed. She yanked her hand free, stepping back. Her heart thundered as she reached for the door, but her vision began to blur. The room spun. Her knees buckled. She stumbled, trying to scream, but her voice was distant. The last thing she saw was Desmond's cold eyes staring down at her, his voice echoing like a distant buzz. "You should have just listened." Hours passed. When Nina woke up, the sky outside was dark. Her head throbbed and her body felt wrong. She blinked against the pain and looked around. Her clothes were in disarray. Her inner thighs ached. Panic slammed into her chest. She tried to stand, but she collapsed back into the chair. Tears streamed down her face before she even understood what had happened. Her voice cracked in the silence. "No, no!" She stumbled out of the office, barely able to walk. The campus was empty. Her world had changed in one horrifying moment. Her innocence had been taken. Her strength violated. The man who had tormented so many girls had now broken her too. But even as she dragged herself to the roadside and flagged down a cab, one thought blazed through her agony. He will not get away with this. Nina barely made it into the house. She limped through the doorway like a wounded bird. Her father, Richard Williams, was in his study reviewing documents when he heard the door creak open. He rushed to the living room to welcome her, but what he saw stopped him cold. Her clothes were rumpled, her face pale, and her eyes vacant. "Nina?" he asked gently. She didn't speak. She stood frozen, trembling. When he tried to touch her, she flinched. It was a movement that shattered his heart. He hadn't seen that kind of fear in his daughter since she was a toddler. "Baby girl, talk to me," he whispered, drawing her close. That's when he saw the blood stain on her skirt. A low, animalistic sound escaped his throat. Nina burst into tears. "Daddy, she couldn't finish. He didn't press her. He carried her into her room and called the family doctor immediately. As the physician examined her, Richard sat outside, fists clenched, breathing like a volcano about to erupt. When the doctor emerged with moist eyes and a shaking head, Richard already knew. His daughter had been violated. The next morning was a blur of rage and pain. Richard paced his study for hours, replaying Nina's broken words. She had managed to whisper the name. Desmond? That was all he needed to hear. This wasn't just any man. This was a monster who had built a legacy out of hurting girls. And now he had taken from Richard what mattered most. All the wealth in the world couldn't fix this. He had given Nina space to be independent, to grow on her own, but now he blamed himself. He should have protected her more. He should have known something was wrong when her grades dropped. He looked at her childhood photos and wept bitterly. But beneath the tears, something else was building, fury. Cold, calculated fury. He was done with the courts. Done with protocols. He would use every resource he had to destroy the man who hurt his child. "He will never touch another girl again," Richard muttered. "I swear it." That same day, Richard contacted his team of private investigators and elite lawyers. He ordered them to gather every shred of information on Desmond and the faculty staff. By evening, he arrived at St. Lincoln University with a convoy of black SUVs. Panic erupted on campus. The vice-chancellor was dragged out of a meeting. The dean stuttered as Richard presented legal warrants and criminal allegations. Within 2 hours, every male lecturer in Desmond's department was arrested. Students watched in shock as police swarmed the faculty building. Desmond himself was found in his office, smiling like a man who still thought he was safe. That smile vanished when he saw Richard. The billionaire didn't say a word. He just stared at him. Desmond opened his mouth to speak, but Richard turned and walked away, his silence louder than thunder. Justice had arrived, not just for Nina, but for every girl Desmond had ever hurt. And yet, Richard's heart remained heavy. Legal justice was coming, but what he wanted was far deeper than a courtroom verdict. What he wanted was revenge. St. Lincoln University had never seen anything like it. Within 24 hours of Richard Williams' arrival, the institution's illusion of prestige and order was shattered. The news of the arrest spread like wildfire, lecturers in handcuffs, staff suspended, and students called in for urgent questioning. Desmond's name trended nationwide, not as a scholar but as a predator. The silence that had protected him for years was broken, replaced by a roar of outrage from both current and former students. One by one, girls began stepping forward. Some anonymously, others bravely in front of cameras. Their stories poured out like floodwaters, forming a mosaic of trauma, betrayal, and fear. Many spoke of his threats, his manipulation, and the way he used the university system to silence their resistance. For every story Nina had gathered privately, there were 10 more no one had heard. And now, with Richard's legal and media machinery behind them, the girls felt safe for the first time. Their tears became the voice of justice. Richard didn't just stop with Desmond. He turned his fury toward everyone who had enabled the abuse. The head of department who ignored reports, the assistant lecturers who helped cover up Desmond's actions, even the female students who lured others in. They were all summoned for interrogation. Investigators scoured office computers, student files, deleted emails, and even surveillance footage. What they found was worse than expected. Falsified grades, fake mentorship documents, secret transactions. Desmond had built an empire of exploitation, and St. Lincoln had allowed it to grow. The vice-chancellor, caught off guard, issued a public apology, but it was too little, too late. Protests erupted outside the school gates, parents, activists, and alumni demanding systemic change. Nina watched from her father's office window as placards rose and crowds chanted her name. She never wanted fame, but her courage had become a symbol for others. Yet, despite the public support, she still struggled privately, haunted by that night, by the pain, by the way her body still flinched at sudden noises. Meanwhile, Desmond sat in his prison cell in stunned silence. For the first time in his life, the system he manipulated had turned on him. He wasn't treated as a professor anymore, he was just another criminal in orange overalls. But still he didn't show remorse. He told his lawyers the girls were lying, that Nina had set him up. He genuinely believed he could still escape this. But Richard wasn't done. He ensured that the prosecution brought every victim's testimony into court. No bribe could save Desmond now. His supporters, those who once praised his academic brilliance, went silent. Former students posted videos, recounting encounters that matched Nina's story almost word for word. The case became more than just a campus scandal. It became a national reckoning. And through it all, Richard watched quietly, not as a billionaire, but as a father who was about to bring a monster to justice. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Reporters jostled for space, cameras flashed, and members of the public filled every bench. Desmond was led in, flanked by prison officers. He looked thinner, paler, but still wore a faint smirk as if confident the storm would pass. When he caught a glimpse of Richard seated beside Nina, his smirk faltered. Nina sat in dignified silence, her hands folded, her eyes hollow but strong. The court proceedings began with testimonies from victims, heart-wrenching stories that brought many in the courtroom to tears. Desmond's lawyer objected frequently, trying to downplay the allegations as consensual misunderstandings, but the weight of evidence crushed every argument. Emails, transcripts, voice notes, forged documents, everything pointed back to Desmond. The jury sat in stunned silence as survivor after survivor stepped forward to share how their lives had been derailed by the man once called a respected academic. Then came the moment the courtroom had been waiting for, Nina's testimony. She walked to the witness stand with poise and grace, despite the fear twisting in her stomach. The silence was thick as she began to speak. She described everything. The subtle manipulations, the academic sabotage, the meeting in his office, the drink, the darkness, the pain. Her voice cracked at times, but she never stopped. Her words were not just testimony, they were a blade cutting through years of silence. Desmond tried not to meet her eyes, but when he finally looked up, he saw no fear in her, only truth. "He didn't just take from me," Nina said. "He took from dozens of girls who were too afraid to speak. I'm standing here today so they don't have to be afraid anymore." Her father wiped tears from his eyes. Even the judge paused for a moment before continuing. Nina had turned trauma into strength, and the court knew it. On the final day of the trial, the verdict was read. Desmond was found guilty on multiple counts: sexual assault, academic fraud, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. Cheers erupted in the courtroom, but Richard didn't smile. His fists remained clenched. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law, but his heart still boiled with fury. As Desmond was escorted out in chains, Richard stood and walked toward the exit with Nina. Reporters called his name, asking for a statement. He simply said, "This is only the beginning." And he meant it. Because for a father who had watched his daughter's innocence stolen, the courtroom wasn't the final battleground, it was just the opening act. Richard had another plan, one that no one, not even Nina, knew about yet. Richard sat alone in his private study the night after the trial, staring at the wall of awards and achievements that now felt hollow. His daughter had received justice, at least on paper. But every time he looked at her, he saw the light that used to shine in her eyes dimmed. Therapy helped, support poured in from across the country, but Richard knew better. Some wounds don't heal with time or attention, they heal with reckoning. That night he made a decision. He opened an encrypted file on his laptop, one he had kept locked for years. It contained evidence of a white-collar crime he had committed a decade ago. A bribe. A forged contract. Enough to warrant a prison sentence. He had kept it buried, protected by power and layers of silence. But now it was his ticket. He forwarded the file to the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission with a signed confession attached. Within 48 hours he was arrested. The media exploded. Billionaire confesses to multi-million-dollar fraud. The nation was stunned. But Richard said nothing, not even when reporters camped outside the courtroom. Nina was devastated. "Why are you doing this?" she cried, confronting him in his holding cell before trial. "You're all I have." He cupped her face gently. "And you're all I live for. But this is something I need to do for both of us." Nina didn't understand. She begged the lawyers to fight the charges, but they told her the confession was airtight. Richard had made sure of it. During the court hearing, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The world called it a fall from grace. But Richard didn't see it as a fall, it was a calculated descent. He had ensured he would be sent to the same prison where Desmond was being held. Everything was going according to plan. When the prison doors slammed behind him, and the smell of sweat and iron filled his lungs, Richard exhaled for the first time in months. He had walked willingly into the same cage as the man who hurt his daughter. But he wasn't there to forgive. He was there to finish what the court couldn't. Inside the prison, word spread quickly. Richard Williams, the billionaire, had arrived. Inmates whispered. Guards straightened. Some offered him protection, others tried to avoid his gaze. But Richard wasn't there to make allies, he was there to find Desmond. It didn't take long. Desmond, now a quiet and broken man, occupied a small cell in Block B. He heard the rumors, the whispers that Richard was in the same compound. Panic returned. He requested a transfer. It was denied. One guard, privately loyal to Richard, leaned into Desmond's cell and said, "He's here. And he's waiting." That night, Desmond didn't sleep. And for the first time in his life, he realized what true fear felt like. Not the fear of being caught, but the fear of facing a father whose soul had been shattered. Richard had come to prison not just to punish, but to make sure Desmond would never harm another soul again. Prison was supposed to break men like Richard Williams, but it didn't. From the moment he stepped through the gates, he moved with a calm defiance that confused inmates and officers alike. He didn't wear fear. He wore purpose. Within days he established quiet influence, using coded messages, discreet financial arrangements, and the loyalty of men whose families he supported from outside. One call from his lawyers could settle debts, pay for surgeries, or fund children's education. In a place where hope was currency, Richard became a silent savior. Even hardened gang leaders began to refer to him with a strange kind of reverence. The Father, they called him. Not because of his age, but because of his cause. But despite the respect, Richard never got comfortable. He didn't come to reign. He came to execute judgment. He stayed quiet, kept a low profile, and waited patiently for the perfect time. Desmond, meanwhile, lived like a hunted man, avoiding eye contact, skipping meals, and requesting isolation. But no door was safe enough, no wall thick enough to protect him from the man he had wronged. Richard studied Desmond's routine from afar. Every evening at 6 p.m., Desmond went to the chapel for mandatory spiritual reformation, a program designed to help convicts find peace. The irony wasn't lost on Richard. A predator attending prayers. A monster seeking forgiveness. Richard never attended those sessions, until one fateful Wednesday. The prison priest was out sick, and Richard volunteered to read from scripture. It was a calculated move. As he stood at the pulpit that evening, inmates filled the benches with curiosity. Desmond sat at the far back, his head lowered. Richard began to read from the book of Ecclesiastes. For every deed there is a time, and a judgment. His voice was steady, but his eyes were on Desmond. Every word was a blade. Every pause a warning. Desmond didn't raise his head once. After the reading, Richard stepped down and slowly walked past him, whispering just loud enough, "Time and judgment have come." Desmond's hands began to shake. That night he didn't sleep. His nightmares were no longer dreams, they were memories, and now they had a face. The guards who had once shielded Desmond no longer cared. Some were already on Richard's quiet payroll. Others looked the other way, tired of protecting a man they had come to despise. Richard never threatened anyone. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. He played chess with inmates, organized literacy classes, even cleaned the yard. But behind that calm was a storm. And when he finally gave the word, there would be no resistance. He met with a few trusted inmates, men who owed him favors, and laid out a plan. No weapons, no chaos. Just a message. They understood. It would happen quietly, cleanly, when the time was right. Until then Richard waited. Days passed. Then weeks. Desmond grew weaker, his skin pale, his eyes hollow. He knew it was coming. He just didn't know when. And that, Richard believed, was justice in its purest form. Let the man drown in the same fear he used to control others. Let him feel the slow unraveling of everything he once stood on. It was only a matter of time now. It happened on a cold, wet morning, one of those days when even the concrete floors of the prison felt colder than usual. Desmond had just finished cleaning the common area, his head down, his thoughts heavy. He moved slower these days, his confidence long gone, replaced by paranoia. He sensed it in the way inmates glanced at him, in the way conversations died whenever he passed by. He even began mumbling to himself, trying to justify the horrors he had inflicted. They wanted it, he whispered one morning. They could have said no, but even he didn't believe those lies anymore. As he walked down the narrow corridor toward his cell, he noticed the usual guards weren't at their posts. His heart skipped. Something was off. When he turned the final corner, he stopped. Richard was waiting for him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. No guards, no sounds, just two men facing each other at the end of a long journey. Desmond tried to speak, but Richard raised a hand. "Don't," he said calmly. "Not a word." Desmond took a shaky step back. You don't have to do this," he stammered. Richard took a step forward. "You took something from my daughter I can never get back. You broke her. You destroyed her future. And you think I don't have to do this?" Desmond's legs gave out and he fell to his knees. "Please. I'm sorry," but Richard wasn't listening anymore. His fists clenched. The rage that had been simmering for months now boiled over. He lunged. One punch landed. Then another. And another. The silence was filled with the sound of pain. Centuries of patriarchal injustice collapsing under a father's fists. Desmond didn't fight back. He couldn't. He begged, whimpered, cried, but it didn't matter. Justice was not always about courtrooms. Sometimes it was personal. By the time Richard stopped, Desmond lay broken, bloodied, and gasping on the floor. A final whisper escaped his lips. She said no, and then he was still. The guards found Richard kneeling beside the body, his clothes stained but his face calm. They said nothing. They didn't call for backup. They simply turned around and walked away. Inmates who heard the noise stayed silent. Word spread fast, but no one dared testify. Some even nodded in approval. Desmond's death was officially reported as a violent fall during a scuffle. The prison medical team recorded trauma consistent with an accidental impact. No names were mentioned. No questions were asked. And Richard? He went back to his cell that evening and read quietly from a Bible he hadn't touched in years. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply turned the pages slowly, like a man finally unburdened. Desmond's chapter had ended. And though it would never erase what had happened to Nina, it gave Richard something the courts couldn't offer: closure. In the days that followed Desmond's death, a strange calm fell over the prison. Guards resumed their posts, inmates returned to their routines, and nothing was spoken of what had transpired. It was as though the prison itself had decided to keep the secret. The warden called Richard into his office once, more out of obligation than concern. "What happened, Williams?" he asked. Richard looked him in the eye and replied, "He slipped." The warden nodded slowly, then scribbled something on a piece of paper. "You're eligible for early parole under good behavior. I'll push the file forward." It was done. No investigation. No resistance. The system, flawed as it was, recognized justice in its own crude form. And in the walls of that prison, Richard wasn't a criminal, he was a hero. Inmates began greeting him with subtle nods of respect. Even those who once avoided him now sought his counsel. He never gloated. He never told his story. But everyone knew. And no one broke the code of silence. Outside the prison, the media moved on quickly. Desmond's death was a one-day headline buried beneath political scandals and celebrity gossip. The university released a final statement expressing deep regret over the tragedy and promised to implement reforms. But deep down, everyone knew justice had already been served, just not in the way the law had planned. Nina, now free from the shadows of fear, began to smile again. It wasn't the same smile she had before, but it was real. She didn't ask her father what happened in prison. She didn't need to. She saw it in his eyes the day he called from behind bars. They didn't speak of Desmond again. They spoke of healing, of forgiveness, not for Desmond but for themselves. Richard had done what he had to do. And now he was preparing to come home. Nina spent her days volunteering with victims of sexual abuse, using her story to give others courage. She became the face of a new movement, a voice for the silenced. Her foundation offered scholarships, legal aid, and therapy for young women. The girl who once walked into a university with dreams of academic excellence had now become a warrior for justice. And the man who once sat in boardrooms counting profits had become the father of a revolution. Behind the silence of the prison walls and beneath the whispers of broken systems, a truth emerged. Some justice cannot be handed down, it must be taken. And though Richard would carry the burden of his choice for the rest of his life, he had no regrets. His daughter was whole again. And for him that was worth everything. Time moved differently in prison. Days melted into each other, each one indistinguishable from the last. Yet, in that monotony, a quiet transformation was unfolding. Richard, once the furious father who stepped into prison with vengeance in his heart, now moved with a serenity that made others pause. The prison guards treated him with a strange mixture of respect and caution. They didn't ask questions. They didn't prod. Even the most violent inmates gave him space. Desmond's death had rippled through the facility, not as an act of revenge but as a reckoning. Everyone had known who Desmond was. Some had daughters of their own. Others had been victims of predators in different forms. When Richard delivered justice, it was as though he had struck a blow for them all. The prison walls may have contained them, but Desmond's end made many of them feel free for the first time. Still, Richard carried the weight of what he had done. At night, when the cells were quiet and the lights dimmed, he would sit with his back against the cold wall and replay every moment. He didn't regret the act, but the aftermath left a hollow space in his chest. Desmond was gone, but so was a part of him, the part that believed in law, in systems, in patience. He had crossed a line he once swore he would never approach. And yet, in that sacrifice he found an odd kind of peace. Letters from Nina kept him grounded. She wrote every week, filling pages with news of her life, her advocacy work, her healing. She never mentioned Desmond. Instead, she spoke of progress, of girls rescued from abusive teachers, of survivors finding their voices, of young women finding strength in her story. Richard read each letter slowly, as if inhaling hope with every word. In those quiet moments he felt like a father again, not just a warrior. The prison chaplain, Father Dominic, noticed Richard's transformation. One day after evening prayers he approached him quietly. "Justice and mercy are not always enemies," the priest said. "Sometimes one walks through fire to make room for the other." Richard didn't respond immediately. He stared at the barred window, the faint glow of dusk painting the sky. "I didn't come here for mercy," he finally replied. "I came to finish something." Father Dominic placed a hand on his shoulder. "And you did. Now maybe it's time to start something else." That night Richard thought long and hard. He had made peace with what he did. But he realized that his journey didn't have to end in a prison cell. There were other battles to fight, ones that didn't require fists but wisdom. If his hands had spilled blood behind bars, maybe his voice could heal others outside of them. Redemption, he understood now, wasn't always about regret. Sometimes it was about what you did after the storm. Outside the prison gates, Richard Williams was no longer just a billionaire, he was a symbol. The media had tried to suppress the real reason behind his sudden arrest, but rumors had started spreading, piece by piece, thread by thread. A few leaked details made their way into anonymous blogs. Some former inmates, now released, dropped subtle hints in interviews. "He did what needed to be done," one said. "Some justice lives in courtrooms. Some doesn't." Nina's foundation carefully distanced itself from the controversy, but privately she knew the truth. And so did hundreds of survivors who sent anonymous letters to the foundation, letters thanking the mysterious father in the shadows, who had restored their faith in justice. Richard, unaware of the public perception beyond the walls, continued his quiet routine. He now taught a weekly class on business ethics to fellow inmates. The irony wasn't lost on him. But the men listened not because of his money, but because he spoke with the weight of someone who had lost everything and still chose to give back. Every Friday Richard received a fresh batch of letters, some from his daughter, others from strangers. He read each one carefully. Many of them were heartbreaking. A girl who had been molested by her school principal. Another who had fled from a guardian who threatened her education unless she submitted. Their stories echoed Desmond's victims, and each one deepened Richard's resolve. One day a guard handed him a thick envelope. Inside was a manuscript, a collection of testimonies compiled by Nina's foundation, titled The Ones Who Said No. Richard read it cover to cover, tears welling in his eyes. In those pages he found purpose. He began drafting a book of his own, not about vengeance but about power, how easily it corrupts and how silence enables it. He wanted to name it After the Fall. It wasn't just about Desmond. It was about every man who ever abused his position. And every woman who ever bore the weight in silence. The prison administration, sensing a shift, began to offer Richard early release programs. But he declined. "When I leave," he said, "it will be when I've done enough here." He mentored younger inmates, some of whom had never had fathers. He helped illiterate prisoners learn to read. He wrote to lawmakers about reforms needed in campus harassment policies. His impact, though quiet, began to spread. And word eventually reached high places. People who once scorned him now spoke of him with respect. "He's not just serving time," one commissioner said, "he's serving truth." Nina, visiting him one weekend, looked at him through the thick glass window. He looked older but lighter. "Are you coming home soon?" she asked. He smiled gently. "Soon. But when I do, I'm not just coming home to be your father. I'm coming home to help every father protect their daughter." In that moment, Nina realized her father hadn't been lost in prison. He had been refined in it. The day of Richard's official release arrived quietly, without cameras or fanfare. The prison gates opened at dawn, and he stepped out into the soft glow of morning light wearing a plain white shirt and dark jeans. He had declined the limousine his lawyers offered to send. Instead, he walked to the edge of the road where a single car waited. The door opened and Nina stepped out. She didn't speak. She simply ran into his arms and held him like she was never letting go. For a long moment they said nothing. The silence between them was sacred. Then she pulled back and whispered, "Thank you." He shook his head. "Don't thank me. I did what any father would do." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Most fathers didn't break the law to protect their children. Most fathers didn't step into hell and come out with blood on their hands. Richard had chosen to become something darker in order to bring light to his daughter's life. And now he was ready to face the world not as a man ashamed, but as one reborn. They drove home in silence, their hands locked. As they arrived at the house, Richard was stunned to see dozens of young women standing outside, holding placards, not in protest but in gratitude. "Thank you for standing for us. Thank you for being the voice when we had none. Thank you, Mr. Williams." Tears welled up in his eyes. He didn't expect this. He didn't know that while he was inside, Nina had shared parts of their story with the world, carefully, respectfully. She hadn't named names. She hadn't revealed his actions. But she told the truth in a way that made people feel seen. Now, standing before him were the faces of a generation his sacrifice had helped protect. He stood still, overwhelmed. These weren't just girls. They were survivors, warriors, and testaments to the fire he had walked through. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt worthy again, not of wealth but of purpose. Later that evening, as they sat under the stars in the backyard, Nina leaned against her father's shoulder. "You didn't just protect me," she said. "You made sure no girl ever has to go through what I did without knowing someone will fight for her." Richard closed his eyes. His heart was full yet heavy. He knew he had done what needed to be done, but he also knew the weight of that choice would never fully leave him. Still, if given the chance, he would do it all over again. "Some battles," he said softly, "you don't fight to win. You fight because losing is not an option." Nina squeezed his hand. In that moment, father and daughter sat in quiet harmony, two souls, scarred but strong, bound by love and fire, now walking into the light together. The sun rose gently over the Williams estate, casting warm light on a home that had weathered storms, both literal and emotional. It had been several weeks since Richard's return, but the house still carried a quiet reverence, as if it knew something sacred had happened. The rooms were no longer filled with the silence of pain, but with the quiet healing of two hearts learning how to breathe again. Richard, now leaner and grayer, started his mornings in the garden, often tending to the same flowers he used to overlook in his days of high-powered business meetings. He no longer chased contracts or acquisitions. Now he spent his time mentoring young men, counseling abused women, and developing a national campaign with Nina's foundation. He had turned the scars of prison into a blueprint for change. And while he never publicly revealed what happened behind those prison walls, his silence spoke louder than confessions ever could. Those who knew the truth respected it. And those who didn't, only saw the man who stood tall despite the weight of the past. Nina's foundation had evolved from a quiet initiative into a powerful movement. With national partnerships, university collaborations, and a growing team of counselors, the voice beyond silence became a sanctuary for young women across the country. Nina led with grace, her speeches delivered not just as a survivor, but as a warrior who had walked through fire and emerged radiant. She traveled across states, hosted panels, and introduced new legislation that required stricter policies on sexual harassment in academic institutions. Her story moved hearts, but her solutions changed lives. And at every major event, somewhere in the crowd, Richard sat quietly, sometimes at the back, sometimes in the front row, watching with pride that was too deep for words. He saw in her the woman her mother would have been proud of. He saw in himself a man reborn not in wealth, but in truth. The world had once seen him as a tycoon. Now they saw him as a father who became a symbol of courage. On a rainy afternoon, the two stood beside a newly unveiled memorial wall at the foundation's new headquarters. Engraved were the names of dozens of girls, some survivors, some not, who had once been silenced by predators like Desmond. At the top of the wall was a quote chosen by Nina: "Our voices may tremble, but they will never be silent again." She turned to her father and whispered, "This is for every girl you fought for, everyone you gave your freedom for." Richard blinked back tears. "No," he said gently, "this is for every girl who refused to break even when the world tried to shatter her." They stood together, rain falling softly around them like a baptism. And in that moment the past no longer held them prisoner. It had become part of their legacy, a painful, powerful story that would inspire generations to come. For in a world that once tried to silence them, they had risen, not just as voices, but as a new dawn, where innocence would no longer be a price but a right. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tales by Tochi for more.